one thing that's kind of good government 101 financing is to have some rainy day funds or reserve funds. And this first question is asking whether or not the organization you have maintains reserve funds or accounts. So answer what you most know, or what is most likely reflective of your own organization. We do find that sometimes people don't know this, and that's a reasonable thing to ask of your employer, and to work for the long-term benefit of your utilities.
All right, very good participation on this poll. So I'm going to go ahead and close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, so half of respondents are saying that they have reserve accounts for operations and maintenance, emergencies, debt repayments, and capital improvements. One person was answering they have one reserve account that's adequately funded, hopefully taking into account all of those things, but it's not necessarily divided up and tracked that way. And then two people answered C and D are basically the same reality as for running a utility, that there's no money in the reserve account or they do not have a reserve account. All right. Key to having reserve accounts and Anna's sustainable finances is having a net positive cash flow. Briefly, that means that at the end of the year, you have more money in your checking account, if your bank account as a utility, than you did at the beginning of the year. So if you started off with, say, $40,000, maybe you have 43 at the end of the year. And go ahead and answer whatever is closest to your reality there on the ground.
All righty, I'll go ahead and close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
All right, so everybody who does know the answer to this said yes. And for those of you who don't know, this too is a reasonable question. Particularly when you look at utility finances and how utilities and public works departments kind of function, there's a lot of internal promotion, and I would generally say it's positive for your career prospects if you're like your organization, want to stay there and particularly become the boss at some point. You will be involved with finances most likely. So understanding that these are reasonable questions to ask. And knowing the answer can help you with planning for your job. So and as we will continue to stress, finances are very important for long-term sustainability of your utilities. Third question here is, what are the challenges to having a net positive cash flow in your utility? So answer the one that's most reflective. You may see multiple stresses on the finances of your utility, so maybe the biggest stress, if that's the case. A, we need to increase our rates. B, we have a lot of debt, so that takes up most of the income. C, we're in need of too many projects. Or D, our funds get absorbed within our organization.
We've actually adjusted this poll question to where you can answer more than one.
Oh, thanks, John. Yeah, so answer all four if that's the case.
All right, I'll go ahead and close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Looks like a few people did answer more than one here. So the need for a rate increase, I mean, people answered all of them actually. The most answered was in need of too many projects. Again, asset management can really help with that planning process, and kind of what's coming up next with criticality is really helpful there. So this is kind of a generalized slide, but for most kind of publicly owned and operated utilities, and most kind of publicly owned and operated financial systems, you kind of have two funding sources for keeping things going at your utility. So on the left, we're talking about capital projects. So these are things that are larger, such as water main replacement. Some utilities would put, expensive equipment, even vehicles in the capital project side. For these, you typically have a mixture of funding sources that are available. So we had Mike yesterday with the state revolving loan fund. That is external funding. So you're getting the money from outside of your organization. Internal funding is that which is raised or has been raised and saved, put aside in the past by your organization. So these would be your reserve funds and kind of the flow of cash coming in to your utility monthly from your customer rates and fees. So for capital projects, you can save up money, you can borrow money, you can potentially get some grants. You can issue bonds if that's something your organization can do. You can take out a USDA loan if you're eligible. Occasionally, some utilities will also have a special fund. So if you go to Atlanta, Georgia, stay in a hotel somewhere in Atlanta, Georgia, you're going to pay a hotel fee for sewer system improvements. If you go to Los Angeles, I believe there's a similar type of tax. People always like to tax the visitors in cities that pays for water conservation and water resource development, because Las Vegas is in a pretty bad place when it comes to available water supplies. So that would be kind of a special fund type of situation. For internal funding, if you have operation and maintenance expenses, so for most utility, the largest operation and maintenance expense is going to be labor, and then typically energy. Sometimes it's chemicals. Sometimes it's wholesale purchase agreements, where if you're purchasing your water or you're a wholesale sewer customer, that can often be your largest cost. All of this needs to be paid for via customer rates, customer fees. Occasionally there's some taxes or impact fees, but for most utilities, the bulk 95% is going to be from those monthly customer bills. Looks like we have something in the chat. Oh, okay, good question from Judy here. She asked, what is debt forgiveness? Is that a grant, or do you have to have, or if you have to first have a loan that is forgiven, does it require matching funding from the facility? So debt forgiveness is, the state revolving loan funds have it. I've seen USDA rural development loans also have it. It is conditional. So you take on debt. So let's say you have $1 million project. You would take out $1 million of debt from the funder. So let's go with the state revolving loan fund. And this is an example. I don't know how Maine structures it. So you actually, as a system, would be indebted for that $1 million. And then there's typically a language in the debt in the debt agreement that if you meet a certain milestone, then some of the debt is forgiven. I don't think I've ever seen 100% debt forgiveness, so it might be 30 or 40 or something like that. So if you had that $1 million SRF loan with, say, 30% debt forgiveness, once you met that milestone, so let's say your wastewater treatment plant is up and running and compliant, might be kind of that trigger, then $300,000 would be forgiven, and you would be on the hook for paying the $700,000. So it's very similar to a grant in that you get resources from outside and you don't have to pay them back, but it's not quite as clean as a grant in some ways. If you don't meet it, then you are on the hook for that remaining money. Practically, I don't think that's going to be a problem because there's so many people with the right incentives lined up. The engineering firm, the construction firm, they all want the project to be successful. They don't want kind of that bad publicity. So does it require matching funding from the facility? I don't know if I can answer that 100%. I would generally say no. So grants often do require a match. In that, you would be required to put up, say, 50% of the funding for a project, and then the grant would cover the other half. And you never have to outlay that 50% grant funding. It comes directly from the grant agency. I don't think that's going to be the case for a debt forgiveness situation. And if it were, oftentimes with any sort of an infrastructure grant, the match fund is actually going to be some sort of debt instrument. So your utility may get an SRF loan to be a match for a community development block grant, for example. That's something like that is relatively common. I hope I answered that. Feel free to chime in the chat if there's further on that. So it's close to a grant, but it's a little different mechanics, I guess, to kind of oversimplify it. Okay, moving on to rates. So rates are extraordinarily important for financial sustainability, for the ability to, have operators like you have, regular paychecks that don't bounce. And they're important for both that operation and maintenance. Again, you basically have to have that internal funding, and also for your capital, because the rates for your water systems and sewer systems are going to almost always include money that is paying back previous loans for past capital improvements. So maybe you had new lift stations put in 5 years ago, and you took out a USDA rural development loan or an SRF loan. More likely than not, some of that customer rates and fees are going to pay back that loan. Rates should be fair, equitable, and cover full cost, including reserve accounts. We do day-long trainings on this. There's some pretty sophisticated work going on with how do you sustain utilities, particularly in communities that have maybe lost population or have very low household incomes. Because pipe's not any cheaper, pumps aren't any cheaper in a situation like that compared to a well-off community. So how do we ensure that people have quality services and health and environment are protected, and we don't overburden people? So there's a lot of discussion around equity, and the funders are taking that into account. They're very knowledgeable about that. But sometimes communities are just faced with pretty expensive water or sewer challenges, and you end up with pretty expensive bills. Your asset management planning becomes actually more important if you are kind of reaching affordability thresholds, in that it's more important. You have, I don't know, maybe like less leeway to do inefficient projects or inefficient work when you're really tight. The idea of rate capacity is that most communities have water and sewer rates that are not approaching the affordability for most of their customers. And in communities that have an elected official or board, there's kind of a willingness to charge, and then customers also have a willingness to pay. If you value the water or sewer service, you're going to be more willing to pay than if you don't, if you kind of take it for granted. Unfortunately, utilities have often been quite reliable and quite cheap, so a willingness to pay is often not that high. We see with little to no customer involvement, both the willingness to charge and the willingness to pay is often relatively low compared to the ability to pay. Eventually, you do hit affordability thresholds. That's when things like grants, loan forgiveness become more important. And often it's some sort of an affordability threshold that the funder is taking into account when looking at, do I award community A or community B the grant? Oftentimes it'll come down to kind of the burden that utilities are placing on household incomes as a deciding factor. turn off my video here, so keep this one good. This is a really good description of rate capacity from Louisville. So I'll let him take it from here.
I think if you ask customers whether they want another 20 cents on their bill a month to fund an infrastructure reserve, sure, you know. Now, at what point does that get to the point where we say, no, I don't want to do that anymore? But, you know, yeah, I think there's a lot more rate capacity out there if you bring your case to your stakeholders, which includes your customers and public, on what you're doing, and then follow it up with doing it and doing it well.
I'd also like to stress some funding for energy efficiency, and I think with both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, I need to come back and relook at this slide because a lot of it is focused kind of on climate change issues. For wastewater utilities in particular, water utilities to a lesser degree, you know, energy can be a pretty big driving force of your cost, and there's often some pretty good savings. Energy efficiency projects sometimes can get different types of outside funding. So you wouldn't necessarily be going through the state revolving loan fund or USDA rural development utility loans. You might be going through what's called an energy service company or an ESCO. And basically you're accelerating equipment replacement and maybe installing better control systems. The theory here is that your utility would basically take on some sort of debt, and the monthly or annual debt service is going to be less than the energy savings, potentially chemical and water savings as well. And therefore, everybody is kind of cash flow positive. You know, the energy service companies, they make some money, you know, by doing the project, and then you know, probably make a spread on the loan as well. And you as a utility have hopefully newer, more reliable equipment. You're saving a little bit of money on energy, and you're kind of locking in that savings over the life of the equipment. So that is something to consider if you are looking at energy efficiency projects. I have found on my wastewater work that oftentimes just reprogramming some existing controls and adding a couple cheap sensors perhaps, and doing a little bit of process monitoring can have quite large energy savings on the wastewater side. So if you have blowers going 24/7, providing air to your activated sludge treatment basin, you're almost certainly in a situation where you can save significant money on aeration cost. So if you're not denitrifying, that's kind of the biggest thing. So oftentimes cycling air on, air off works pretty well. Kind of depends on what your ammonia limits are, but there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit out there on the wastewater side. We're going to move on now to the fourth core component, that being criticality. So criticality is kind of my favorite. I think it has the best exercise of this 2-day training as well. So we'll just kind of get right into it. So there's a few different components of criticality, and there's a lot of good online resources with regards to criticality. And if this piques your interest, I would suggest also reading up on the issue of redundancy when looking at criticality. This training doesn't go into it too much basically for lack of time, but that also plays a very big role in criticality. So if you're interested in this topic, read up more on redundancy in utility systems. So anyhow, for the sake of this training, we're basically looking at two different components of criticality. The first one is, what is the probability or the likelihood that an asset is going to fail? So is it high? Is it low? Is it something that's likely to fail multiple times in a year? Something that's likely to fail, less than once a decade? That's one thing we're looking at, but we're also need to keep in mind failure isn't necessarily, breaking. So you might have perhaps a water well, and the water well has MCLs So, and one of those, let's say arsenic or nitrate has been creeping up in the past years. The well's in perfectly fine shape. If we were giving it a condition assessment, it would be a 1, very good condition, but the well is going to fail to provide the level of service necessary if that nitrate level or if that arsenic level continues to climb, because you won't be able to meet that MCL anymore. So that's one type of failure. You can have regulatory failure. You can also have failure that is regulatory in another sense. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that your wastewater treatment plant regularly puts out ammonia at 5 milligrams per liter. And, they've been doing some water quality studies in the area, and they find out that that ammonia is significantly impacting local aquatic populations. So it's harming the fish, it's harming the mussels, and we're going to need to see a lower ammonia from your wastewater treatment plant. So your wastewater treatment plant hasn't changed, the water coming to it hasn't changed, but the rules governing its operation may change. So your plant, which could meet permit just fine, may no longer be able to. So one or multiple of the components of that wastewater treatment plant are now failing because they're not meeting that minimum level of service again. So you can have regulations change, or you can also have kind of things happen to you, such as maybe nitrates increasing in groundwater supplies. So that's the first point here. How do my assets fail? Just understanding that they can fail in multiple ways is important there. But for most assets, they're not going to fail because water quality standards change or anything like that. They're going to fail because they reach the end of their useful lives, or they just become too expensive to continue to operate, and some sort of replacement or rehabilitation is needed. So for most utility assets, the condition of your assets is going to be the driving force into the probability or likelihood your asset will fail. So everything being equal, those assets which are in really good condition are going to be relatively unlikely to fail. Those that are in poor condition are going to be more likely to fail. And another thing to keep in mind here is kind of like, what is the general functioning of that asset? So on the lower left here, we have appears to be a water main break. So water mains are pretty simple. They don't have a lot of moving parts. And in fact, you have the valves and hydrants attached to them, but the mains themselves don't ever move. So they just kind of sit there. Their basic role in this world is to hold pressurized water and let it flow through it. They do a pretty good job, and they don't tend to have a lot of problems until they've experienced something. So maybe they've been damaged by, if it's a pipeline near a railroad, they've been damaged by repeated vibrations, and eventually they have problems. It might also be corrosion. It might be poor installation. So there's just more stress and strain on the pipes than there should have been. But generally speaking, things that don't have moving parts tend to have longer lives than things with moving parts. So you would expect a water main to likely last longer than a fire hydrant. A fire hydrant likely to last longer than, say, a blower system at a wastewater treatment facility. So that's another thing, like just how long does this type of an asset last in general? And the answer there is the more moving parts, the more electronic components in it. Those are going to lead to generally shorter lives. Those that are just like a piece of metal that's standing up in the air or buried underground, piece of plastic like that, those are going to tend to have lower probabilities of failure, longer lives. The second thing we look at with criticality is, what is the consequence if the asset were to fail? So for this, we kind of have to look at consequences in a couple different lights. So let's look at that water main break. Generally speaking, a water main break for most utilities is going to cost you somewhere in the $1,500 to $2,000 to cure it, maybe a little more in Maine, because you have to dig deeper holes. It takes longer time than here in Kansas, where our water mains are typically about 3 feet deep. I imagine yours are quite a bit deeper. So the cost to repair, maybe it's $2,000, maybe it's $2,500 for a typical water main break. By the time you have the labor, by the time you repair the street, you have repair parts, you know, the loss of water. It's going to be somewhere in that. So that's the cost of a water main repair. However, there can also be other costs that are imposed on society. There can be legal cost. There can be environmental costs from certain types of failures. So on the wastewater side, you know, there's a lot of permit violations related to sanitary sewer overflows or sewer treatment plant bypasses. And there's often a legal consequence for that. Oftentimes, there's also some sort of environmental consequence for that. And in some cases, there's going to be social consequences. So environmental consequences could be a fish kill. Social consequences could be something like a beach closure because the sewer plant hasn't, you know, effectively disinfected. It's not safe to be to have water contact. So when we're looking at consequences for many assets, the consequences are greatly reduced by having redundancy in them. So when we look at redundancy, this is more common in water utilities than sewer utilities. Sewer utilities tend to have more single points of failure than water utilities because you have, you know, your pipe network doesn't have multiple flow paths in it, where in water utilities, oftentimes you can shut off a valve and the water will still get to where it needs to go on regular daily usage. In sewers, you have single points of failure. If a pipe collapses, you often get problems for everything upstream of that pipe. So, but there are sewer assets that are very redundant, and they're designed to be redundant. If you step back and think about how your life would be different, how your job would be different, how your stress level would be different if your lift stations only had a single pump, I think the turnover in the sewer industry by employees would be way higher. The amount of sanitary sewer overflows would increase greatly, but we see sewer lift station pumps. They often have mechanical difficulties. They may clog, but that lift station generally has another pump or two to take on the burden. And what would be potentially large environmental or social consequences, very costly to customers if finished basements have raw sewage backing up into them, you know, public health threats, is basically with redundant lift station assets that, you know, potentially large consequence failure becomes pretty minor. Like, okay, you know, we have a few hours to pull the pump, repair it or replace it, and then we put it back going. So what could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost through a pump failure becomes the cost of just repairing the pump or putting a new one in. So redundancy is huge when it comes to reducing the consequence of an asset if it fails. So that's a very important thing. And we'll be going through some exercises where we'll be considering some of that redundancy. So when we look at asset management planning, when we look at reinvesting in water and wastewater systems, one thing that we often really emphasize is looking at the critical assets of your utility and investing in those assets at a higher rate than those that are not very critical. Likewise, when we look at the operation and maintenance activities of a utility, it's generally better to put your operation and maintenance towards the critical assets. So that those assets that you've identified as being very critical, you might give more attention to. Those assets that are not deemed very critical, you would give less attention to. So this question is asking if your organization has their assets prioritized by criticality.
All right, thank you for all of the responses so far. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay. Very common answer here. We see results line up with this very, very frequently. I don't know very many utility operators that if you ask, you know, what would be the worst item to break in your utility, that they wouldn't quickly give me an answer. More often than not, it's kind of the last lift station before the treatment plant or the lagoons. It's not always the case, but that often is kind of what we see. And then looks like 2 of the 6 answering said they did have a list of their most critical assets, and we're finding that to be more common. There's been, you know, push for asset management planning and utilities in kind of the US now for, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years. So we see more of that having been done. Oftentimes engineers working on, you know, a large project are going to look at criticality of the various assets as they try to define what should be included in the scope, what can be left out given the variabilities around funding and things like that. So it's good to have if you can. So the next question here is, do the needs of the most critical assets drive investment decisions? Answer A, that yes, we focus spending on our critical assets first, or no, but we need to get a system in place to do so. I do understand that B is a leading answer, leading question, I guess.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right. Okay, so over half of the systems represented are focusing their spending on the critical assets first. That's great. And hopefully, as we go through the exercises, we'll see how that's valuable. Both kind of that capital and also your operation and maintenance. And I have some good examples on wastewater for that. Back to Louisville. He talks about criticality with regards to kind of those social consequences, like what happens if a system fails to our customers. Ultimately, that's why your utilities do exist.
Does it feed a critical customer? Okay. Does it feed a hospital? Does it feed a school? Does it feed a medical complex? You know, is it, you know, so that's one consequence. You know, so when you start looking at doing risk assessments on your pipe, which essentially is what that pipe evaluation model did, but now we're doing more formal risk assessments. And when you look at that, you know, you got really the probability of occurrence. You know, standard risk assessment stuff. You know, how likely it is to fail. And then secondly, what's the consequence of the failure? You know, and part of the consequence of the failure is the cost of that failure. And then what it does to the service to the community. You know, so if you have a pipe that if it fails, it puts out 200 people versus a pipe that puts out only 20 people. Well, you know, you need to spend more investment on that 200 people than you do on the 20 people, or at least do that first.
So kind of at the end, he's talking about where the investment should be headed.
Does it?
We also kind of try to outline this in a visual fashion. So and we'll be doing this in an upcoming exercise. But the basic idea here is that you can kind of group your assets into various risk categories. So the highest risk assets are going to be those that have a high probability and also a high consequence of failure. So let's think of a very large pump. So that's been in service for 35 years and has been having recent problems. The probability of failure is pretty high on that. There's moving parts. It's old. Kind of a good combination there that the failure might occur soon. A large pump, at a minimum, to replace it is going to be quite costly for most utilities, and you will see consequences vary based on the utility. So for most smaller utilities, a large pump failure is going to be pretty consequential just because it costs a lot of money. It will be more consequential if that lack of service, having that pump be offline, interrupts service, interrupts fire flow. Those are other consequences that may occur should it fail. So basically, by rating the probability of failure and the consequence of failure of the assets in your community, you can begin to see those that are the higher risk, medium risk, and lower risk. And then once you know the relative category, you will be able to make decisions about, okay, I only can maintain, maybe a third of my assets I can do regular maintenance on. Which third of my assets should I do? How do I spend my time? Likewise, you only have so much money to reinvest every year. Which assets am I going to replace or rehabilitate? Ranking them by criticality is a good way to help kind of reduce the risk of your assets. Here's some of the work in at the sewer side with regards to collection systems.
I think on the collection system side, we were, up until about 10 years ago, totally reactive. And when CMOM, that phase started coming into place, then we truly became more proactive. And then we were finding a lot of our problems, collapsed pipe and et cetera, that we didn't even know were there. But then where we needed to take the next step was implementing the asset management program. Then there was no prioritization of that proactive work. We were treating our major interceptors with just as much importance as an 8-inch sanitary line in a cul-de-sac. And if you're living on the 8-inch sanitary line in the cul-de-sac, that is the most important thing to you possibly. But as a whole, as managing a department and managing your assets, you have to treat those differently. And so one of the first things that we did on the collections side was, under the strategic plan, was to form that risk task team. And that risk team was set out, their mission was to help us develop that criticality of the assets. What are our priority as far as our maintenance goes? To be proactive, but yet to be logical in the proactive nature. And then in turn to develop that probability of failure, so you can then in turn to properly prioritize your capital investments.
So yeah, what he said, I think he laid out.
I think on
good. I'd also like to highlight energy savings. So you can prioritize energy efficiency, energy savings project in a similar manner to how you prioritize the criticality of your assets. So you often would ask, what's the level of energy use of the asset, and then also what is the amount of potential savings of the asset. So you can get energy usage here on the horizontal, feasibility of addressing energy usage on the vertical. Couple examples here. So water is really heavy. If you have, a large pump that's lifting water, your energy usage is going to be relatively high. Now, the feasibility of addressing that energy use maybe is medium-ish. You can get a more efficient motor. You can maybe put a variable frequency drive that would save some. But ultimately, you're going to use a lot of energy because you're lifting something heavy from a lower elevation to a higher elevation. So the feasibility is not going to be super high on something like that. On the other hand, let's say you have an old incandescent light bulb somewhere in your treatment facility. The energy usage in that relative to your entire system is going to be relatively low. But the feasibility of addressing the energy usage of an incandescent bulb is really, really high. I mean, you can reduce the energy use like 90% by going to the hardware store and getting a $3 light bulb in most cases. So the feasibility of that is going to be very high. I will tell you, I used to be in the utilities at Hayes, Kansas. We had an old activated sludge plant with, anaerobic sludge digesters. And our sludge pump from the digesters was an old diaphragm pump, and it was driven by compressed air. So the pump was a single point of failure in the plant. There was only one there, and it would have been kind of hard to put two, just based on how the plumbing was. And that was a relatively high consequence of failure. So we're going to overlay energy use and criticality here. So this old diaphragm pump, the probability of failure was pretty high. We'd had a lot of problems. It had, a lot of years on it. I think parts were getting hard. So the probability of failure was towards the high end. The energy use was also quite high. And it wasn't like blower high, but it was higher than most things. And part of that was because that it had a lot of moving parts. The energy use was high because its energy use was compressed air. Air compression is typically about 25% efficient. And then the diaphragm pump itself maybe is 60% efficient. So your energy efficiency from the wire to actually moving the liquid sludge is very, very low. So that makes for very high feasibility of addressing energy usage, because you have like a 20% feeding a 60%. Multiply those two together and you're like 10% efficient or something like that. So there's a lot of room for energy efficiency there. Likewise, there's a lot of room for addressing consequences of failure. So we put a type of screw pump in, very simple, very low speed, also brand new. The efficiency of that from the wire to the water was probably in the 80%. And it was also just going to be more reliable, fewer moving parts, simpler design, much more energy efficiency. So we had a high risk, high priority asset in our sewer system, and we replaced it and made it a pretty low risk and low priority asset from an energy use. So it was still a single point of failure. So the consequence of failure was still relatively high with the asset, but the energy usage and the probability of failure really dropped. So you went from clear upper right probably to something in the upper left quadrant with that asset. So kind of net positive for everyone involved. And that's another thing I'd really like to stress with criticality, that you have some control of your assets that you have identified, that once you've identified it as a medium risk asset, that doesn't mean it will always have to be a medium risk asset. So you could add redundancy. You could perform an overhaul. You could plan for an outage and have spare parts on the shelf. There's a lot of kind of agency that water operators and utility managers have when it comes to criticality of their assets. There are some things out of your control. So you might have, let's say you have an industrial park. There's speculative land out there. It's served by utilities. Those utilities probably, if they were to fail, and it's a brand new development, no customers on it, very low risk, very low consequence of failure. But let's say, you have your community's largest employer builds a new facility out there. Suddenly the consequences change. So you have control, and then some things you don't have control over. So it's important to keep in mind that criticality is something you have some levers of control over, but it's also a moving target, because your community changes over time. Where the schools are located, where a nursing home, where a hospital, where a factory is located, all can change over time. So we're going to go into a criticality workshop here. This is from the AM Can Work manual, which John will be providing a link to. So these are worksheets that can be done for your own utility assets. It is important that we have a date on them, because as I mentioned, criticality can change over time. And so what is a critical high consequence of failure asset today, maybe a lower consequence of failure asset 2 or 3 years from now, because something has changed, either your management and or kind of the customer base of your community's systems. So we're going to begin to walk through here. So from yesterday, we have that well pump and that sewer pipe. Again, that well pump, we kind of said it's in pretty good shape. When it comes to redundancy, it is important to note that there's a well field and 2 wells exist, either of which can supply Green Village. So we have some redundancy there on that well pump. And likewise, we have some redundancy with an upcoming asset that you'll see. Now, that wastewater asset, that was that old concrete sewer pipe on a cul-de-sac. I think we agreed it was like a 4, so pretty poor shape as far as the condition of it. We're going to introduce some new assets for Green Village here. The first one is a storage tank. So it's 100,000 gallons. We know where it is. It was inspected and repainted back in 2002. That's probably getting towards the end of that paint job. The operators kind of perform visual inspection, but like most water operators, they're not like tank experts. They haven't noted anything, so it's probably in relatively good shape. It is possible to pump water directly from the well field to the customers, but the ability to provide fire flow is compromised, and it's often difficult to meet peak demands. And that makes sense. The wells can supply 110 gallons per minute. If you have both of them on, you're probably not doubling that flow. Maybe you can get 150. So you're not going to have fire flow in your community with a situation like that. The utility manager would like to add a new tank to help store water for firefighting. Now, we're going to throw in another wastewater asset. So this is a surface aerator on the community's oxidation ditch. It's 125 horsepower fit speed, so pretty high energy users. They think it was installed back in 95, and it's had a lot of problems in the last couple of years. So 11 total repairs in the last 2 years. They've been able to keep it going, but if it's out of service for 48 hours or more, the treatment process is going to be compromised. Permit conditions will not be met. Likely you'd be missing on ammonia, biochemical oxygen demand, and things like that. Parts have been hard to get and repairs have been costly. The operator thinks it's operating within the design spec. It runs 16 hours per day, so pretty high use asset. All right, so we're going to try and outline these assets for the village of Green Village. So we're going to walk through this first, and then we'll be kind of taking the temperature of the class for the additional assets. So the sewer pipe, when we're looking at the probability of failure and the consequence of failure in this example, we're going to give the probability of failure a 3. So, it's been in bad shape for quite a few years now. I believe the television was from 2009. It's still going. So probably not imminent risk, but certainly something that we should take care of. The consequence of failure, we're going to put it at a 3 as well. So yes, it would be pretty consequential for those 10 houses in the community who receive service. But when you're looking at the whole broader system of Green Village sewer, it's probably not that big of a deal. So there's a lot of uncertainties. There's a lot of questions we don't know with this pipe. So when we're looking at gauging criticality of an asset, for this sewer pipe, there's quite a few things we can probably get more information about that can help us understand that probability of failure. So the easiest one, the most logical, is run a sewer camera through the pipe. It's been 12, 13 years at this point. Things may have changed. They may be more or less the same. So being able to compare how things are versus how they were would be very valuable. This is, if I were running this utility or operating this utility, that'd probably be my highest priority. To understand that probability of failure. Just get pictures, understand what's going on there. Now, to understand the consequence of failure, there's quite a few things we can actually learn here. So one of those is measuring pipe depth. If your utility system and your sewer pipe is 3 feet below ground and it collapses, you can take care of that. If it is 18 feet below ground and it collapses, you're calling in a contractor almost certainly. So your response time is going to be variable depending on that pipe depth. Whether or not that can be an in-house repair is going to vary by pipe depth. And the cost to repair that is also going to vary a lot by pipe depth, whether you're doing it in-house or are having kind of an emergency contract repair done. Additionally, when we're looking at consequences, what's on the surface of the pipe is going to drive the cost. So, if it is flat ground that's, just kind of grass or, something like a mowed lawn, really cheap to restore. If your pipe is located on a steep hillside, you're going to have to put up erosion control. You might have to hydroseed it to prevent erosion. That's going to make it more expensive. If it's under, a gravel alley, pretty cheap. If it's under a brick street, going to be pretty expensive to deal with. So the consequences of failure will vary quite a bit depending on what is on the surface of the pipe. Now, I think we've all probably seen, a garage built over a sewer or water main. Hopefully that's not the case here, but that makes the consequences quite a bit higher. Just the legal wranglings was, why didn't the city protect its right of way when the customer built their garage over it? There's going to be a lot of kind of fallout from something like that. So that would kind of be the worst case scenario there. Another thing you can do is figure out kind of what happens if the pipe were to fail. So let's say the pipe fails, there's sewer backup going on. Is it sufficiently below the houses that the overflow occurs into a large buffer strip before it would ever hit surface water supply? So it's in a grassy area, it's in a forest, no nearby surface water, relatively low consequence of a backup in that case. Perhaps all of the houses have finished basements. Does it back up into one or more of those? Does it overflow into their yards? Perhaps everybody is on a slab or a crawl space type of house, so less likely to have an overflow get into personal property that way. Kind of the worst case would be, this sewer main is right by our drinking water intake. So your drinking water intake is a couple hundred feet away, in which case that would be really consequential from a social point of view, because you probably have to not run the intake for a while until things cleared up. So that can better understand the consequence of failure. I will note on this one and every other example we have is that information has a price. So understand what is valuable, what can reasonably be left out. So if you're going to better understand the probability of failure by running a sewer camera through the pipe, additional information that's basically cost-free at that point is pipe depth, approximately anyway. Figuring out what is on the surface of the pipe, you're going to be there anyway. And it might take a little more work to determine what happens with the backup, because you may not know, house construction there. But certainly the surface material and the pipe depth, if you're running a sewer camera through that, is basically cost-free. So get that information for the sewer pipe. So we're gonna have some polling on this one to gauge the relative probability of failure and consequence of failure of this storage pipe or storage tank asset. So as I mentioned, it's the only tank in town, installed back in '85. It's 100,000 gallons. It was inspected and repainted back in 2002. The operator checks it annually. There's no issues noted. The community can run without it. to provide water to customers, but you're not going to really have fire flow in that case, knowing the information we know about Green Village as well. So should be a poll coming up here. So you'll need to scroll down on this poll. Go ahead and vote on the probability of failure. So 0 being it's not ever going to fail, to 5 being very likely, and likewise on consequence. 0 failure basically has no consequences. 5 being, it's the end of your utility. You may as well call it in.
I'll give everybody just a little bit more time to answer this poll question. I'll go ahead and close it in 5, 4, 3.
All right, our answers varied quite a bit on probability from a 0 to a 3. So nobody thought it was like imminently going to fail anyway. The consequences varied a lot, and this is often something we see on this storage tank question. Very high consequences to very low. So unfortunately, we're not able to tie Zoom into the presentation directly. We researched that. We're going to give it a probability of failure 2 and a consequence of 5. Open for debate on that. So the probability of failure, a storage tank doesn't do a whole lot. The water comes in, water goes out. You need to have the vent, proper. You need to prevent corrosion, things like that. But generally, water tanks don't fail all that often. And oftentimes the failure is caught before it's catastrophic. The failure is too much corrosion, too many problems with it. So a new one is built before you actually lose the service of it. Now, the consequences we're going to put at a 5, primarily because of cost and the time during which you would be out of service. So, a storage tank, I don't know what the cost per gallon is these days, but this is going to be, a 6, if not 7-figure type of project for the community. Most communities aren't going to have that money available, so they'll have to go through some sort of a lending or grant program. It's going to take a while to get those resources, during which you have to live without it. Which if there's fire, depending on the community, is it a high fire risk community, low fire risk community? But needless to say, you're going to lose some fire coverage during storage tank outage. So that's kind of something as an example on the storage tank. So there is additional helpful information that could help better understand the probability and consequence of failure. So, if people have been at the utility and they've operated without the tank because the tank was being cleaned, it was out of service for some other reason, really understanding how that functions is important. You can also hire cleaning and inspection. So to better understand what's going on with the tank, if there are problems that the operator is unable to see, that would be helpful to know as well. We're now going to move that well pump that we discussed yesterday. So what rating for probability of failure would you give, and the consequence of failure for this well pump? Back installed, 25-year life expectancy, but it was installed in 2003. My poll just covered up my words. It's operating fine. There's been no problems, and it is one of 2 well pumps, either of which can supply the community in water. So this is another vote twice, probability followed by consequence.
All right, I'll go ahead and close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, we have answers all over the map on both of these, from pretty low probability of failure to relatively high. And then consequence also being, I mean, I guess the class was more consistent there, towards lower end for consequence of failure. So a couple things on this. You'll begin to notice that criticality is really kind of utility specific. So, Green Village, it has 2 wells. So either of which can supply the town. So it's not a huge emergency if a single well is out and you have relatively good prediction that you'll be able to get back up and running sometime soon. Now, if the casing were to collapse, that's different than if a well pump goes out of service, just because of time frame. Where I was in Hayes, Kansas, I believe we had 27 operable water wells, and the most we needed in the middle of a hot summer day was something like 4 or 5 operating. So the failure of any single well was kind of a non-issue from a disruption of service type of thing. Now, the cost also was kind of expensive, but we were well funded as a utility. We had money budgeted to take care of, because when you have 27 wells, you're going to have problems with 1 or 2 of them every year, basically. So we always budgeted to be able to take care of a problem like a well pump failure. So, the probability of failure, we didn't have a lot of control over, but the consequence of failure due to our own utility conditions was pretty minimal, because we had the money for it. It wasn't a whole lot of money compared to our entire utility operations, because we had some system size, and it ran almost zero extra risk to customer disruption if a single well were to go down, and they did go down. So it was kind of okay. Now on the well pump, so depending on your own community system, you might see failure of a well pump as being a really big deal, or if it's no big deal, is kind of how I would typically see it. So we all have our biases coming into rating things like this. So we're putting it at a 3 and a consequence of failure of 4. So keeping in mind the consequences, both the cost to the utility and the customer impact. So, it would be helpful in rating the consequence of failure if we knew more about Green Village's finances. If this is something they can easily absorb, or if they're going to have to scramble and be creative financially. So on the well pump, this is a good opportunity, since it has moving parts, it probably has regular maintenance procedures. How do we reduce the probability of failure of this well pump? So one thing you can do is establish a maintenance program and have regular inspections. So, an operator would be out there, checking for weird amp readings, noises, vibrations, excessive heat. And then having planned outages to do the maintenance is a way to reduce that probability of failure. Also, the well pump, and it's not discussed anywhere, it requires electricity. And oftentimes wells are somewhat in a remote location from town, because that's where the water is, and the town wasn't necessarily built where the water is. Obtaining backup power generation can help reduce the probability of failure, because one way a well pump fails is that it doesn't have power. It may be relatively low risk for some wells. It may be pretty high risk for others. So having that backup power generation can help reduce that probability of failure. How can we reduce some of the consequences of failure? So having spare parts available or having them at a neighboring utility that has similar equipment can help reduce the consequence of failure, because you're reducing the time of outage of the pump. If you have things on hand, it's a matter of getting the time to do it, to make that repair, rather than waiting on things to come lately. And, I've been working with a lot of wastewater utilities lately, and it seems everything's like 8 to 12 weeks out. and then you get 12 weeks out, and it's another 2 or 3 weeks before anything gets delivered. So those spare parts have really come in handy. You know, I know a wastewater plant here in Kansas that their control system is a touchscreen. It's gone out. So they don't really know what's going on with their plant right now. It kind of has a default mode. It's probably meeting most permit limits, but they have very little way to control it. So those spare parts can be pretty handy. Another thing you can do to reduce the consequence is to ensure the storage tank is full prior to inclement weather. I would also add prior to July 4th, when, you know, there's a higher fire risk because of, you know, people with fireworks and things like that. So if there's a bad forecast where it can knock out power, you have that storage tank full. That storage tank is a redundant well pump in some respects. You have 100,000 gallons, which is, you know, quite a few minutes of runtime on that pump. So you give yourself a little more buffer to reduce the consequence of failure. So you might be able to add a couple hours of outage without having any customer disruption if that tank is full prior to, you know, a predicted time during which it is likely to go out of service. So generally inclement weather. You can also prepare. Preparation is important for utility resilience. So educating the operators on the task to repair, they should know where the diagrams for the assets are, how things are taken apart and go back together. You can also pre-locate vendors. I've seen this done a lot with regards to specialty equipment, especially with regards to like well maintenance issues. So you pre-locate vendors to repair and replace. So, you know, I know who I'm going to call up. They know that I might be calling them up sometime. They've agreed, possibly informally or formally, sometimes with payment, that you become their priority when you make that call to them. So there sometimes is some sort of a retainer type fee with that. That being said, it might be a good insurance policy for your system to have pre-located vendors on hand that are willing to drop what they're doing to come to your aid. Hopefully they haven't made that agreement with every other utility in the state, because, you know, major storm comes through, who knows how that falls out. We're going to do the similar exercise for the blower. Again, this is at an oxidation ditch. We don't know the manufacturer. Quite a few repairs in the last couple of years. There are permit compliance issues if it's out of service for 48 hours. Parts are hard to get, repairs are expensive. It runs 16 hours per day. So there should be a poll coming up on this one too. So vote on both of these.
All right, thank you for the responses. I'll go ahead and close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Okay, what we see here, towards the higher side for both probability and consequence of failure. I will note that oftentimes we have operators from both water and wastewater utilities that if they only operate a single utility, they tend to de-rate the consequence of failure for the utility they don't operate. So, you know, it's just your wastewater permit, no big deal if you don't comply with it. So we might have a little bit of that going on. But both towards the high side here with the blower. So similar to the well pump, we're going to go through some exercises here. We put it at both a 5 and a 5. Again, the consequence of failure, you know, I don't know how much expensive it is. I don't know Green Village's budget, what their reserves are. The consequences of failure could potentially go down based on that. But what can we do? As utility operators and utility managers here, Let's look at probability of failure here. So again, similar to the well pump, we could go ahead and, establish maintenance and inspection frequency, take it out of service on our time when we want it to be out of service to do the repairs and maintenance rather than on its time. Similar to the wells, most wastewater plants have backup power generations, but not all do. That might be an issue here. You could fully rebuild the existing unit if you can find the parts to do it. So you'd be taking the condition that we rated as poor, maybe it would go up to good. That's likely going to reduce the probability of problems. Better yet, you could replace the new unit, keep the old for spare. So you're building redundancy into your system that way, drastically reducing the consequence of failure. Even better, you'd keep the old one for spare and rebuild the parts that need rebuilt on it. So you'd have a really reliable backup unit. You still have the issue of like having to put it back in service, unless if you can kind of put the new unit and the old unit in the same oxidation ditch, which could be possible. I've seen that done. How do you reduce the consequence of failure here? So having spare parts on hand really would help with that. Obtaining a temporary aeration unit for emergency usage. So perhaps you have a tractor with a power takeoff. You can put some sort of a paddle wheel and attach it that way. That can help maintain compliance while it's out of service at relatively little cost. You're just putting something that attaches to a tractor. You already have the power supply, so your cost isn't going to be that great. Get it off of a third-party auction site from an old fish farm or something. Not ideal, but better than nothing. And sometimes those are the choices you need to make. Prelocating vendors for repair, similar to the well, could get you somewhere as well. So we're going to graph this out, and if you're the utility manager, the superintendent there in Green Village, you've graphed these out. You find that you have 5 high-risk assets, but the blower is the highest risk. So maybe that's the one we need to pay attention to in next year's budget in the upcoming capital improvement plan. And then maybe the well pump after that. Obviously, you do this for your own utility, you'll have very different results, most likely, because your utilities are different than Green Village's. Your utilities financial situation is different. Your customer base is different. Your treatment operations are different. Your storage is different, and that's okay. It's very important to say that an asset in one community is going to have very different ratings than the exact same asset in another one. So that well pump in Green Village, high risk asset. The well pump when I was at Hayes, Kansas, low risk asset. Same well pump, same cost, but the consequences are just different for the failure of it. So criticality, as we saw with our polling here, judgment calls are just they're required, but they're still helpful. It's better to go through the process than to not go through the process. Not everyone may agree with every rating. That's okay. Come to a reasonable consensus there. It should guide both maintenance and investment in your utility system. As you put capital back into your system, that's the reinvestment. And then the maintenance, maintain those higher risk assets more, maybe less on those lower risk assets. Utilities can often reduce probabilities and or consequences of failure by taking prudent actions before failure. So it's very important to understand that you have abilities to reduce the probabilities or consequences of failure of your assets. With that, I'm going to take a 5-minute break. So back at, let's see, the 1:20 here, 2:20 there in Maine, and we should be able to wrap up on time and allow you to get back to your afternoon there. So see you in 5 minutes. Okay, we are going to get back to it. Rounding out the 2-day training with life cycle costing and then some asset management implementation. So the idea of life cycle costing is that every utility asset you have, whether it's in the ground, in the air, whether it is powered or non-powered, whether it consumes chemicals, whether it consumes a lot of labor, has costs that occur from the initial design all the way to the abandonment or removal and sale or disposal of the asset. So some of those costs are going to be the capital. Often that's going to be the largest cost, but sometimes not. Operation and maintenance are going to be major costs. Sometimes operation and maintenance are the highest cost of a life cycle for an asset. Sometimes repairs are going to be major, sometimes not. Rehabilitation, sometimes you rehabilitate assets, sometimes you don't. So sewer mains, sewer manholes, very likely to be rehabilitated. Water mains, pretty unlikely. You may have legal related costs or environmental related costs to some of the assets, either their initial installation or their ongoing, their continued operation. So, environmental cost, maybe if you have, a water main or more likely a sewer main, you might have some wetland impacts when you install it. That's an environmental cost that you have to offset. Legal is often, you have to have permits. You have to have a system of control that you legally own it, that you have proper rights of ways and things like that would be example of legal costs. On the capital cost, an asset, capital versus operation and maintenance, an asset that often has what seems to be pretty high capital cost, but the capital costs are very, very low compared to the operation and maintenance cost, is a high use electric motor. So depending on, the number of hours per day it's used and your electric rates, oftentimes a high use electric motor, about 90% of its total cost is going to be the electricity you purchase for it over its life. So if you're looking at electric motor A and electric motor B, and electric motor A, it's 2% more efficient, but 10% more costly, it's still probably worth going with electric motor that is more efficient and more costly up front because you'll save it over time, assuming it's a high use electric motor. Now, if it's an electric motor that powers a backwash pump that's used for 10 minutes every day, might not be worth going with the more efficient one from a life cycle perspective. The basic concept is to compare your options when we're looking at life cycle costing. So most of the time, utilities are not looking at, should I buy a whole new utility system? It's rather, I have an individual asset and I need to figure out how to manage it. So in this option, we're doing more maintenance to the asset, getting a longer life out of it with option one. So we're spending more money on operation and maintenance and repair over time, hopefully getting a 30-year life out of it. So this could be, something with moving parts that you rebuild, maybe a pump, for example. Option two, you're going to say, nah, I'm not going to rehabilitate it. I'm not going to spend so much money on repair. I'm just going to replace it more often. So by doing the math, you have option two. You're going to just buy new replacements more often, do less maintenance, spend less annually on that. You're not going to do a rehabilitation. Figure out the cost over the life cycle. In this example, for a 30-year time horizon, the option one is $250,000 in cost. Option two is $300,000 in cost. So when we're considering life cycle cost here, option one is best. Talk to your finance people. They're going to say, well, what about interest cost, time value of money, and things like that? Relevant, but for the sake of an example here, to keep it simple, we did ignore those things. Inflation would obviously be something you would look at as well when looking at life cycle costing. So for option one, it's the most economical for this set of circumstances. It's not always most economical to keep an old asset in service, particularly if it's inefficient, or if spare parts are limited. It may be better to buy new and replace it frequently. Other examples are going to have a different result in this one. So I'm not at all advocating maintain your stuff and keep it till it's really old by spending a lot of money on it while it's in service, because that may not be best for life cycle costing. And there's other things to consider as well. So, option two may actually have less risk of failure because you always have a newer asset in service, where in year 28 and 29 of option number two, your risk of failure might be quite high. So there might be other reasons to not go solely by life cycle costing. Level of service would be a good example that you would also need to bring into consideration. So generally speaking, though, routine and preventative maintenance can help extend the life of an asset. That's true for your own homes, your own vehicles, and for most assets within a utility system. However, maintenance takes resources. It takes operator time and it takes supplies. Sometimes supplies are pretty expensive, sometimes not. It can also take tools that are not cheap. So sewer jetting, sewer camera work, that's pretty expensive equipment to be able to do those tasks. Turning a valve, less expensive equipment. You can do it by hand, but that's more time. You can do it with, mechanical valve turning, less time, more supplies. So in any case, maintenance takes resources to do, and trying to balance what to do and when to do it. Asset management planning would generally advocate utilize that concept of risk so that criticality ranking comes into play there. So when you're looking at your operation and maintenance decisions in your own utilities, do you let risk drive your operation and maintenance decisions? So answer A, yes, our operation and maintenance focuses on our high priorities assets first. Yes, we do O&M on almost all your assets, or no, we do not have an O&M plan in place.
All right, I'll leave this poll open for just another minute. And I'll go ahead and close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, great. Looks like nobody's getting too far behind on operation and maintenance. So even with doing O&M on all your assets, those who answered that, I would advocate to possibly relook at how you're allocating those that time and those resources, and I'll provide a couple of examples going forward. So on your higher risk assets, preventative maintenance is very important to try to prevent or forestall failures. Likewise, every time you visit the asset, you have either a formal or informal inspection of it. People get familiar with how things sound, how things feel, how things, how much heat it produces. So the more times you're near that asset, the more likely you are to detect problems before they maybe are failures. Often is the case with something like a pump or a blower. Your lower risk assets, so maybe only routine maintenance and minimal preventative maintenance, since those assets can be allowed to fail. The management strategy here is called run to failure. And it's talked about here in Cincinnati. So here we go.
And I think that's a tough concept. Being an engineer, that's a tough concept to swallow, that you're not going to nail it perfect the first time, that you're going to have a lessons learned. And there's a lot of other concepts, I think, with asset management that are tough for engineers, for instance, to swallow. I remember 4 years ago, the first time I heard the concept of run to failure, I said, well, that's ridiculous. We're not going to run anything to failure. That doesn't make it, we're not going to do that here. And having, at that time I was in the collection system, like, I'm not running anything to failure. As an engineer, I'm trained and I have a mindset of, I'm going to repair this situation. I'm going to resolve this problem. And reality of it is, when you properly prioritize your assets across the board, you can't fix everything right away. And so, yeah, you will have to run things to failure, as much as that goes against the grain of what engineers have been taught, and even just utilities in general have been taught over time.
So this slide here is more for illustration than a recommendation, but we laid out the criticality of our assets: high, medium, and low risk. If you're looking at your time and your budget for maintenance, it might be wise to have it err towards something like this example, where more of your maintenance dollars are being spent on those higher risk assets, and less on those lowest risk assets. So even if you are a utility who does have the capacity to do maintenance on all of your assets on a regular basis, it may still be worth moving some of that maintenance time and money to those higher risk assets. So I know historically a lot of wastewater utilities have attempted to do some fraction of cleaning on their sewer lines on an annual basis. So oftentimes it's 20 or 25%. So you get around to the entire system every 4 or 5 years. Now, for utilities that have some newer lines or places where there's been cured in place pipe, it really generally won't make a whole lot of sense to, clean and camera those brand new lines that frequently, unless if there's known problems. So maybe you have, a strip of fast food restaurants that cause grease problems, or there's an industry that causes problems, or there's a sag in the pipe or something. So it might be wise to move some of that low risk pipe maintenance towards the higher risk pipe maintenance. So instead of doing all the pipes every 4 years, perhaps some pipe you would even look at annually, or at least clean annually, and some other pipe you may have on a 5, 6, or 7 year maintenance schedule. And this could help reduce the risk, because if you've outlined the various segments of pipe in your community, some of them are really high risk, and some of them will be very, very low risk. So does it make sense to treat the low risk pipe the same you are treating as the high risk pipe when it comes to cleaning and camera work? The answer in most cases is probably no. But it is something to definitely consider. Along the same line, communities often have a similar maintenance schedule for water distribution valve exercising. Now, the water distribution valves by your elevated storage tank, those are very likely to be very, very critical. Likewise, those surrounding your hospital might be very critical. Where those that are dead ending at a cul-de-sac, not really that important. So you might also look at the frequency of valve exercising and inspection in a similar manner. So those are just pretty common maintenance tweaks that could help, improve or maintain the level of service, reliable service for your customers when it comes to how do I assign my maintenance dollars. I would also say for those utilities, and it's probably less of a problem in Maine than here in Kansas or as you get further south, what percentage of your time is being spent on things that you can just go to the hardware store? Operators cost quite a bit an hour to have. They often have very specialized skills. Are they repairing, we call them weed whackers here, weed eaters? Are they spending a couple hours of their time to repair a piece of equipment that's only $100 or $150 to replace down at the local hardware store? So that would be another thing to look at when you're when you're doing maintenance, is it better to just replace sometimes? So run that to failure rather than repairing it. So that's another consideration that you may want to look at. We also want to look at life cycle costing when it comes to replacing your assets. So we've all probably had something either at our utilities or as a piece of personal property that it just became too expensive to keep. So if you look at asset condition over time, as time progresses, your condition goes from, great, it's brand new, and it degrades. Some things degrade pretty quickly, maybe a pair of cheap shoes. Some things degrade quite slowly. So like a new sewer pipe is going to degrade quite slowly. But once it starts to go, it could go pretty quickly. So understanding how things decay over time, how their repairs become more frequent is important. So to minimize life cycle costing of your assets, if you replace it too early, you're likely to waste money by not using all of an asset's life. So historically, not in the last year or two, if you'd bought a car every year, you're throwing away a lot of money. Because the value decreases a lot faster than the functionality of most new cars. Last year or two, kind of crazy. So throw that example out. Now, if you replace it too late, you're wasting money because the repair will be more expensive. So, let's go back to a vehicle. If the transmission is causing problems and your engine is smoking on a 15-year-old car, does it make any sense to repair it any longer? The answer, probably not. So you don't want to replace it too late because the repairs start to eat, really consume a lot of money and time. So you kind of want to have a good balance there. The optimal replacement point is going to vary based upon how critical that asset is. So if it's a single point of failure, with really high consequences of failure, the optimal replacement point is going to be earlier. So this would be something like an ambulance. An ambulance is typically replaced relatively early in its life cycle because the consequence of failure is pretty high. People can die if the engine goes out on the way to the hospital. But if it's a push mower that you use around your well house, the optimal replacement point is going to be later in time because it doesn't really matter. If it breaks, I can go get a new one anytime I want to. And the worst thing that happens is the grass is a little taller than it should have been. So consequences of failure matter a lot when you're looking. It is not possible to know the optimal time to replace every asset. This diagram here, the optimal replacement point is shown right before a repair is needed. Do we generally know when a repair is going to be needed? No, not generally. So it's a little bit of your best judgment here, but knowing when, if you want to replace it early in its life cycle or later in its life cycle, is very useful. So utilize that concept of risk again. On your high risk assets, err on the side of replacing too soon before failure. Think like an ambulance. You want to replace it in a planned manner. So you may have some pump systems that every 10 years you pull them and replace them. That way you have continued reliability with them. So your replacement point is going to be when they're in relatively good condition. Now, some utilities would have some ability to move some of these assets around. So, I've seen municipalities that the police vehicles are kept on for summer help later on. You can maybe do that within your utility systems, move some pumps around to lower critical assets. That may be appropriate in some cases. Now, your lower risk assets, as they were talking about in that Ohio utility, you're going to allow them to run to failure and then replace them afterwards. So you're going to have managed failure. So, that push mower, that small lift station pump, done a couple of repairs on it. It's time to replace it next time it goes out. So you plan that the next failure that occurs there, the next repair that's needed, it goes out of service and you replace it with something new. So part of having good life cycle costing is having planning for when and how you spend your money. This is generally referred to as a capital improvement plan. So basically, a capital improvement plan is a series of larger projects that is laid out over some sort of a time frame, typically 5 to 10 to 20 year time frame. So your capital improvement plan might include a new storage tower 7 years in the future. It might include replacement of 2 lift stations 3 years in the future, and then maybe some line replacements in between years. So does your organization have a capital improvement plan on this poll? All right, so looks like we have a couple even with 20-year plans. That's kind of surprising. And then we have a couple with 5-year plan, and then one that had no formal plans. So anyway, capital improvement plans are important for long-term sustainability of your system, and they help inform, what rates you need. They help inform, what kind of financing I should be pursuing right now. So oftentimes utilities will try to maintain a kind of consistent level of debt as they pay off an old SRF loan. They'll be able to bring on new without having to increase rates. So a capital plan helps with that as well. And they also help you prepare for regulatory changes. Generally, a regulatory change, you have some time to respond to it. Your capital improvement plan can say, okay, to meet my new ammonia limit, for example, I'm going to need to invest a certain amount 3 or 4 years into the future, and you're able to plan with that. So move on here. So your capital improvement plan also helps you with validating and ensuring that you're doing the right project at the right time at the right cost. So we've probably all seen those assets that, like, why was this built like this? And oftentimes it was something went wrong in the planning process. So I've been to wastewater treatment plants that are 3 times too large for the community. In that planning process, people, and to be cynical, I would say the design engineers promoted that the community was growing a lot faster than it actually was. That was in their incentives were aligned with that. Design engineers often get paid as a fraction of the total cost of the project. So bigger project, more pay. Had the capital improvement planning process went better, the community would have said, okay, that's a nice projection, but we are here where we are right now. Let's plan and build out for the next 10 years instead of maybe the next 40 years. So that would be a good validation procedure. So you really want to make sure that the capital improvement is needed. You really want to make sure you've chosen the correct alternative, because you typically don't get redos with a capital improvement. So that community whose sewer treatment plant is 3 times larger than it is needed, they can't just go and replace it. They're still paying off the construction of it. The alternative is not really an alternative anymore because the financial capacity has been taken up. You also need to make sure all information is needed to make a good decision, that it's provided. When there's assumptions being made, question them. Is our town really going to grow this fast? Are there additional conservation efforts that are going to decrease our sewer flow? If you're a coastal community in Maine, what does sea level rise? What does climate change impact with us? Energy efficiency should also be considered in all future replacement projects, because that really drives some of those life cycle costs of the project. We're now going to wrap up with asset management implementation. So the Louisville, he has a few words of advice for you here.
You know, first of all, know your assets, know how well they're performing, and based on that, that'll define the needs that you have, and then embrace your stockholders and stakeholders, and letting them know and bring them on board for what needs to get done. I think that's the key piece. And the other one is just do it. You know, don't wait. You got to do it. You got to do it. The benefits are there, and any little bit you do, you'll see a great amount of benefit.
So yeah, and I would totally echo that. You know, we went through those 5 core components, and you might be saying to yourself, well, that one doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't feel a need for it, but there might be something that it would be really, really helpful to you. So feel free to take up just that. Or maybe you're thinking, well, I don't need asset management. My collection system's in really good shape. But maybe your lift stations aren't, or maybe your treatment facility is, you know, a lot of the equipment's reaching the end of the life. It's okay to do it just on, you know, part of your system, and really hone your skills on that. You don't have to tackle everything at once, but maybe consider a place where it's going to be most valuable to you.
You know,
So any of the activities in asset management can help lead to improvements. It is a self-educating process, although it seems clear you have good incentives there in Maine to get some outside help to do it, but it is something you're going to learn by doing. So the more asset management work you do in-house, the better knowledge you and your employees are going to have of your system, and that's valuable because you know, the fact that they learn more about the assets within their control, that's going to help them when an emergency happens, when you have main break or some weird weather system. They'll be able to better operate their system during emergency work. It's important to note that asset management may seem like, you know, this is just one more thing to do. Well, utility operations, utility management, it's not going away. So it does pay to consider, well, how can I do this more efficiently? How can I do it better? How can I do it perhaps at lower cost, so that maybe I'm not fighting quite as many fires? Asset management helps you maybe work a little smarter, but it does take some upfront investment. And fortunately for you guys, the state of Maine SRF has some pretty good incentives that help reduce that investment if you need somebody to come in. Getting started, it's important to have a champion or a steering committee. Obviously, that depends a lot on the size of your community. You can absolutely do it yourself. Getting outside help may be appropriate for part of the asset management plan, maybe for the entirety of it. A lot depends on your organizational culture. One place where outside help is typically very valuable is with mapping and condition assessment efforts. You know, we talked storage tanks. Perhaps if you've not run a camera through your sanitary sewer system, you know, outside help can really bring you a lot of information relatively quickly there. There's a lot of resources available. You can contact me or John or some of my colleagues at the Environmental Finance Center Network. A lot of technical service providers they're throughout the country are also helpful, depending kind of on how the states have set up their contracts with rural water associations and things like that. So there's a lot of good information out there to help you get started. You might be asking, well, where do I start? Honestly, anywhere. We went through, 5 different core components. You don't have to start or go in the order we went in. Some starting points, maybe what really makes sense to you. Where's the highest need? It might be what's easiest. Do the easiest if you're like, okay, this is important. I need to understand what I'm doing before jumping into it. So do the easiest part. Fire hydrants would be a good option. It might be what you know best. So maybe you spend most of your time at the treatment facility. You know all of the equipment. You know its condition. Put it down on paper. Begin the asset management plan there. It might be what you can see, or it might be what's most important to either your staff, customers, or the governing body, perhaps your regulator as well. If you don't have that good map, and some of you said that you did not have electronic maps, and a good GIS electronic map may be a good starting point for you to consider. So anytime you start something, having some easy wins is good to keep the momentum going. So you gain support both within your organization, with your customers and governing body, by documenting and celebrating some of those successes. So if you have a map developed where there wasn't one, show it off. Go to a commission meeting and take five or 10 minutes on the agenda and say, look, this is what we now have. This is some of the powerful tools of it. This is how I plan to use it in the future. You might also try to document some savings on capital projects. So basically documenting the savings amount. So say our asset management plan helped us better define a scope for this capital project. We save money because it meets our needs now, and it's really the project we need right now. Documenting savings from energy efficiency can also be valuable. So the asset management plan involves documenting what you've done and will do. Keep it both simple and sustainable. It is important to update annually, or periodically. Annually helps. That's a good idea. A lot of utilities update their inventory and maps continuously as projects are done. You might also consider coordinating and integrating with other plans that your utility or your community may have as a whole. So in summary, asset management is the way you will do business going forward. It's never done. Neither is utility operation, neither is utility management. It is about working harder. No, it's not about working harder. It's about working smarter. So here's a good video, again, from Old Forge, New York.
I think that picture sums it up. And this photo was taken from our publicity website. It was entered in a photo contest, and it's taken right up here on the Fulton Chain of Lakes. And you got kids and a dog sitting on the shore of the lake, and that's the ultimate goal. We want to protect our waters. We've got a number of lakes and rivers in the area, and that's one of the reasons people like to come here. This is right out behind the wastewater treatment plant, and as you can see, we have a direct discharge to the Moose River, and it's a scenic waterway as well as a classified trout stream. In the background you can see Route 28 coming into town, and on any given weekend there are hundreds and hundreds of canoes and kayakers that go up and down this river. People use this for fishing, swimming, boating, and with the direct discharge right here, making sure that our wastewater treatment plant is everything that it should be is pretty important.
Then from up in your neck of the woods.
All you old school public works guys out there that are looking at this, give it a chance. It does work.
So with that, I'd like to acknowledge some of the funders who helped create the training and bring it to you today. US EPA, through subcontract with the University of New Mexico, has funded this. The original training development was funded by the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. The New Mexico Environmental Finance Center, now Southwest EFC, helped design the training materials and the manual that John is providing a link to you. Asset management in the water and wastewater industries really got going in New Zealand and Australia. It's basically how they do business now. So that's kind of was transferred across the pond over here. And then there were 18 utilities. You didn't get to see all of them that participated in the filming portion of the project. None of the interviews were scripted. Some of the people are still working there. The videos are about 10 or 11 years old at this point, but many of them are still out there working. So I would like to highlight there is technical assistance available for water and wastewater both, for small systems. So go to efcnetwork.org click on Get Help, or just email me or John. We're in that network. We can provide it to you. It can be any of those areas of expertise I highlighted yesterday. Even if you have a question that's not within it, feel free to ask. John is put up a poll if you'd like more information on technical assistance. All right, thank you. I will leave, whoops, with contact information for me and for John as well, if you have questions on, what do you call them in Maine? TCHs or something like that, for your continuing education hours. So with that, I'll stay on the line for a couple minutes. If you have any questions, otherwise,